Oh, hello. I didn't see you come in. Welcome to my humble abode. Make yourselves comfortable. In fact, since I have actual guests, and not having the Tesco security guards yelling at me to fuck off, do you want me to tell you a story? No? Okay, fair enough. Well, tough shit. I'm reading one to you anyway. So this is a story about the railways of my queen and country, Great Britain. So, like everything in the UK right now, our railway system is pretty terrible. Fares are expensive and trains are always late and overcrowded. Now you may be wondering, why are they so terrible? Well, the biggest reason why everyone thinks the railways are so god-awful here is because they are privatised, meaning that the government has no control and the railways are instead in the grimy hands of companies. Now, privatised rail itself is nothing new. Countries like Brazil does have a similar system for their railways. The only difference being is that in Brazil, companies have to manage passenger rail, freight rail, and look after the tracks all at the same time. Whereas in the UK, there are separate companies for passenger rail and freight rail. So you may be wondering, why are Britain's railways even privatised in the first place? Well, in my last documentary video about the advanced passenger train, I was constantly mentioning the two words, British Rail. Prior to 1996, this was the state-owned organisation for the railways. But then, in 1996, it was privatised completely by the former Conservative Prime Minister, John Major.
And it only cost me £3.85.
Despite an uproar of outrage from the opposition parties, John Major argued that he wanted to privatise British Rail because the system was crumbling. Before being privatised in the 1990s, their trains were always late and their rolling stock was falling apart. John Major also wanted to privatise British Rail so that the UK could jumpstart an open market for the railways and to encourage competition, despite the fact that it isn't really a competition. Because let's say that I want to get a train from London Bridge to Littlehampton. The only operator that offers this service is Southern Rail. Thameslink and South Eastern, which also operates from London Bridge, does not have any interest in doing that service. So it isn't a fucking competition if no other operator is interested in running a service from London Bridge to Littlehampton. You fucking stupid blonde-haired four-eyed Tory cunt. But still, despite the protests, the dreaded Railways Act was passed, and British Rail was privatised, leaving the railways in the hands of private companies. And for the past 30 years, the British public would fall victim to the most disgusting acts that the oncoming companies would commit. In this documentary, we will be exploring all of the most atrocious train operators, and what is currently being done to fix it. Welcome to the hellhole that is Britain's privatised railways.
Delays, cancellations and severe overcrowding. Over the past few months, that's what commuters on
7:30 here at Harpenden, and there already have been 2 trains cancelled and
So, the original intention for the Railways Act of 1993 was to privatise everything in British Rail and transfer everything into the hands of private companies, even infrastructure. But that side of the privatised railway didn't really last long, as the British public wouldn't be praising this new system for long as trouble was already brewing. So originally in 1992, when the Conservative Party at the time was beginning to pursue the privatisation of British Rail, there were plans to keep infrastructure in the hands of a state-owned body and the train operations themselves would be privatised. But then, a man by the name of Robert Horton came in, and he was just basically having a meltdown and demanded that infrastructure should also be privatised as well. And of course, the Conservative Party supported his decision. So the government dropped that state-owned idea, and then boom. A couple of years later, British Rail was privatised completely and infrastructure for the railways would now be in the hands of a company called Railtrack on April Fool's Day. And Robert Horton would become CEO. Within its first couple of years of operation, Railtrack was actually doing a pretty cracking job. It was making a huge profit, and they were already beginning to pursue several ambitious rail projects by collaborating with train operators. Everything was going pretty smoothly for them at first. But then, until the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the company would be quickly thrown into deep controversy. In 1997 and 1999, two of the most devastating derailments in Britain have happened at Southall and Ladbroke Grove on the Great Western Main Line. And it didn't take long for Railtrack to be held responsible, particularly for the Ladbroke Grove crash. In a nutshell, the Ladbroke Grove rail crash was caused when a Thames Trains Class 165 networker collided with a First Great Western HST after the Class 165 passed the red signal due to the fact that the driver mistook the red signal for being an amber signal due to a massive amount of sunlight reflecting off of it. If you don't know what an amber signal is, then it is basically the indication that another train is coming up ahead and that the driver has to prepare to stop at the next signal that would turn red. Now, what makes this crash so baffling is that this accident was never supposed to happen. In the UK, all trains are fitted with a system called Automatic Train Protection, or ATP. This is gonna get nerdy, but it's a system where it's constantly monitoring where the train is going, and if it detects that the train has passed the red signal, then it will automatically apply the brakes and stop the train completely. However, this wasn't entirely the case back in the day, in the year 1990s. According to an investigation, it was discovered that Railtrack didn't actually fit the trains with an automatic train protection system. Apparently, British Rail did make plans to create an ATP system in all trains after the aftermath of the Clapham Junction derailments in 1988, but then when Railtrack took over in the 90s, those plans were scrapped due to costs. What happened to their record profits? I don't know. Why are you looking at me? After the Ladbroke Grove rail crash, several more derailments occurred, and every time it would always conclude with Railtrack fucking something up. After years of poor investment in infrastructure and safety, claiming innocent lives all because of a profit margin and pathetic, spineless regulation, Railtrack finally went bust in 2002 and it was taken over by a state-owned body, Network Rail, something that Robert Horton would have hated.
ネットワークレール、You have did you do it well, but you have networked your rails for far too long, old friend.
Meanwhile, down in the south of England, things were getting just as bad as Railtrack, as private passenger rail was also proving to be worse than what British Rail did, as one of the first privatised passenger rail companies had already failed. A bright new day in early April or May. So in 1994, after British Rail was privatised, the railway network was split into shadow franchises, a part of a railway that covers specific geographical areas. And these shadow franchises would wait for any company who would be willing to take over passenger rail duties. Among those shadow franchises were Network South Central and Network South Eastern, originally the areas where Network South East used to serve, a former sector under British Rail. These two shadow franchises were then finally taken over in 1996 by a company called Connex, and it was then split into two operators, Connex South Central and Connex South Eastern. Now, the name Connex itself was not a new name in the world of trains. In fact, Connex used to have another operator in Australia's privatised railways, called Connex Melbourne, where it was in control of all suburban rail routes in Melbourne. However, Connex did not have an incredible reputation in Australia. Their staff were always rude, their services were rubbish, and trains would often skip stations just so the company could get more funding if they achieved excellent punctuality targets. But still, despite their bad reputation in Australia, Connex was still awarded the takeover of the South Central and South Eastern franchises. But little did Connex know that their bad luck in Australia would follow them into Britain and would inevitably cause their downfall. So the first Connex operator to get the boot was Connex South Central. The biggest reason why was their rolling stock. While Connex South Central did inherit a few more modern trains like the Class 319s, Connex South Central's biggest fleet of trains were the Class 205s, Class 207s, Class 411s, Class 421s and Class 423 trains. Or as we Brits called them, slam door trains. Slam door trains have become an icon of the South London landscape in the 1980s and 1990s.
This is the London Overground service to Dalston Junction. The next station is Wapping.
And while they did create some rather nostalgic memories for the average millennial Londoner, these wooden chum buckets were also death traps. Their small doorways made wheelchair access impossible, their asbestos lining in the interiors made them toxic, and their wooden framing and structure made them easily destructible in the event of a crash. British Rail have tried to phase them out in the past with their Networker program, but loads of slam door trains continued to run well into the early 2000s. And a large reason for that was Connex South Central. Because of the fact that Connex South Central was specifically ordered by the Department of Transport in their contractual agreement to not invest in new rolling stock, Connex South Central continued to use their inherited slam door trains, which at the time were well over 20 years old, and at this point the trains were really starting to show their age. One Connex South Central slam door train running to London consisting of 8 coaches had its rear coupling snapped and the train then lost its rear 4 coaches, leaving them stranded and stuck in the middle of the main line. Other issues with the slam door trains also involved a flea infestation and also a temperature problem that put the train into freezing temperatures. And still, despite all of this, Connex South Central refused to invest in new trains. And as a result, this is what caused Connex's reputation of an extremely unreliable service, as Connex South Central had the most highest amount of cancellations every year. And this, of course, made a lot of people pissed off. So much so, in fact, that Connex South Central became the biggest targeted company for passengers to complain about on the online forum called Delays.net, a 1990s website that was basically made for passengers to vent their meltdowns about their horrible experiences when travelling on trains. So basically, a 1990s version of Twitter. Every year, Connex South Central would receive hundreds of complaints from angry passengers complaining about the lack of explanations from customer service staff regarding cancellations, and the continued use of dirty slam door trains despite the fact that other companies like C2C and Chiltern Railways were investing in brand new trains. And Connex's hypocritical and pathetic responses, such as blaming British Rail for not replacing all of the older slam door trains, and also Railtrack's incompetence for Connex's unreliability, were not really helping as well. Oh no guys, it wasn't my fault for my poor reliability, no! Please ignore my contractual agreements, it was these two! Bunch of naughty bastards, aren't they? British Rail, who do they think they are, not investing in replacing their wooden chum buckets? Even though we are doing the exact same thing and British Rail was planning to replace all of them, filthy state-owned swine. But it wasn't just passengers that were pissed off with Connex, it was also their drivers. In the year 2000, for example, the company was hit with several strikes from the RMT and ASLEV over concerns of safety and non-contractual overtime. This then led to a very poor management of the staff and the drivers. The terrible management of staff was so poor, in fact, that one day a Connex South Central train driver stopped his train at Three Bridges, and I shit you not, he got out of the train and left his passengers behind so he could pick up his kids from school. After years of poor management, strikes, rolling stock that was literally falling apart, and hundreds of delays and cancellations, the government had had enough of this clusterfuck of a franchise, and so on the 25th of August 2001, Connex lost its South Central franchise. Now, if you're wondering what happened to Connex Southeastern after all of that, well, Connex Southeastern actually did pretty well during the whole South Central clusterfuck as well as its aftermath. Yeah, it did have slam door trains for a while, but they did manage to replace all of their slam door stock with hundreds of brand new Class 375 Electro Stars and Class 376 Capital Stars built by Bombardier. But Connex Southeastern's downfall was not because of poor reliability or anything like that. Their downfall actually had to do with money. In 2003, Connex was somehow struggling to keep their Southeastern franchise profitable. In December of that year, they even asked the Strategic Rail Authority to give them a £58 million grant on top of their £55 million grant to keep the franchise running. And they even wanted to have £200 million in fucking subsidies. Which all comes from taxpayers' money, by the way. So, if you do the maths, the grand total of money Connex asked for in grants and subsidies from 2003 is, let me just get my glasses on, £313 million. As you can imagine, the SRA really wanted to know why the hell are Connex asking for huge amounts of money and where in the world was this money even going to. So the SRA told Connex to only spend this money into investing into the Southeastern franchise and not spend the money into paying their overseas businesses, like Connex Melbourne. Only for the SRA to then suddenly change their mind, and then they decided to strip the Southeastern franchise from Connex entirely on fraud grounds. Connex was outraged at these allegations and they demanded the SRA to give them their franchise back, but the SRA said no, and thus this ends the story of Connex. The South Central franchise and the Southeastern franchise would then later be taken over by Southern Rail and Southeastern Trains a couple of years later. Southern Rail itself didn't really do that much better than Connex in their first couple of years, but over time they did improve. Although I will say though, the only bad thing about Southern is that they replaced their Class 455s. What a shitty rail operator. It's still unclear to this day as to whether Connex did actually invest their grants into improving the Southeastern franchise or used it for fraud. However, considering the fact that they wanted £200 million, I think the fraudulent evidence can speak for itself in my opinion. So now you know how terrible our railway system is. It is full of the most atrocious and corrupt companies who have been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of lives just so that they won't risk losing their profit, and companies who have had a terrible track record in the past and the government just lets them operate anyway. So now I bet you're wondering, what has the British government done to fix it? Well, over the years, the government has introduced a lot of plans to fix the railways, but nothing has ever really happened. Well now, that looks like it's about to change. In the UK, we currently have a new government led by the Labour Party, which to any American viewers watching this video is pretty much like the UK's equivalent of the Democrats in the US. And as of writing this video, the Labour government will be introducing a new state-owned body called Great British Railways. Now, the name Great British Railways itself is nothing new. In 2021, the previous Conservative government had actually planned to create a similar state-owned body with the same name in their rail reform bill. The only difference being is that the Great British Railways that the Conservatives proposed was that it wouldn't be a British Rail 2.0, because of course it wouldn't. It would instead be a mix of a state-owned body and a regulator, where it would take over Network Rail and will be in charge of track maintenance as well as fares, but it would also be a regulator for the rail franchises, where it would have the right to strip franchises completely if they don't follow any of their certain requirements for passenger comfort and reliability. This state-owned body, however, never came into proper fruition. However, now that the Labour Party has taken over the government, they will establish Great British Railways with more or less the same functions as it would have had under the Conservative government, but the biggest difference is that it would bring rail franchises under public ownership. Now, do I love this idea? Yes, absolutely. I was jumping in joy when I first heard this being announced. Because if you couldn't tell at this point, I don't like privatised railways, nor do I respect the private sector's involvement. All that the private sector has done for the railways in Britain is that they made them even worse than British Rail. It has allowed the most disgusting and slimy corporations to lie to passengers and rob taxpayers' money. And the fact that a government with some actual fucking common sense is finally getting rid of this system for good? Of course I love it. For the most part. In my opinion, Great British Railways isn't enough to fix the railways, and I'll explain why. So the first problem that GBR has is how it's going to be established. So according to the Labour Party's Keep Britain Moving plan on their election manifesto, it states that Great British Railways will nationalise passenger rail operators as their contracts expire, so that the government won't pay the companies in compensation. And if rail franchises don't follow the terms of their contracts, then the Department of Transport will terminate their contract early and will bring that franchise under GBR's control. And while it is a very good economic standpoint, it's not an efficient one. Lots of rail operators will have their contracts expired well into the late 2030s, years ahead of Labour's 5-year term in Parliament. So if you're going to stick with the system, then you're just going to have this mutated hodgepodge railway where half of it is privatised and a small portion of it is nationalised. Another issue that Labour's rail nationalisation plan has is that certain departments in the rail industry, like manufacturing and rolling stock leasing companies, firms that give trains to different franchises, are still going to be privatised. And in my opinion, that's just ridiculous. I mean, I get why manufacturing would be privatised. A lot of state-owned railways in Europe also get their trains from private firms. But I don't get why rolling stock leasing companies would not be nationalised. Rolling stock leasing companies charge rail franchises huge amounts of money to lease their trains. Millions. What if Great British Railways is suffering from a lack of funding and they can't afford to purchase trains from leasing firms? Will there be some sort of emergency funding to cover that? Will there be an exemption where GBR will not have to pay for trains and it will just own trains? I don't know. Labour never mentioned it. This is the most weakest rail nationalisation plan that clearly had no thought process put into it. There will come a day when Britain's railways will be fully nationalised once again, but at this point, I don't see it happening anytime soon. With every boomer and millennial still having PTSD over British Rail, the tsunami of weird right-wingers complaining that rail nationalisation is a political move, and the way with how the oncoming Great British Railways body is going to work, I don't think anyone is going to embrace full rail nationalisation. But in my humble opinion, rail nationalisation is not a political move. It's just basic fucking common sense. Britain and any country can have a railway that will be perfect to run with wonderful trains and low fares. And countries like the Netherlands can prove that. It's just that the only way that it can be run perfectly is that it all comes down to the people in charge. If we can have a government that is dedicated to make things convenient for passengers, then we can have a publicly owned railway that could finally be the railway we all want. And the privatised railways have clearly shown that they are not the solution. They had a chance to make the railways better from British Rail's incompetence, and they didn't. So there's only one solution: bring it back into complete government control. It's unknown as to whether Great British Railways will truly be the British Rail we all wanted it to be, or if it will just make the railways worse. But at the end of the day, I'm just glad the government has finally got a tad bit of common sense.